Thank you so much, Leah. So firstly, got to say I'm thrilled to be here as well. Really excited to be presenting and talking with all of you about redistricting. Um, Before we really get into the subject matter, the first thing I want to ask is just what council districts are folks living in or advocating for or care a lot about? You could either put it in the chat or just shout it out. And I ask because that'll kind of help me tailor where we're going, what districts we're talking about tonight. If you are unsure of what council district you're in, seems like a lot of you know, but that's also helpful to know, and I can make sure to show how you can find that out. But I see CD1, CD3, and CD7. Also, if you know your council member, but not the number, you can put that in, and chances are I'll be able to figure out the number. But as of now, 1, 3, and 7.
Okay, we've got Speaker Adams, we got Majority Whip, Brooks Powers, and Natasha Williams in the house.
So that's 27, 28, and I missed one there, but okay, 27 and 28, we can definitely look into it.
31.
Botcher, 31, thank you. Botcher is 3, so a bunch of you all are in CD3. Another, okay. So I'm not gonna look at all of these, but we can definitely look at a few of them. 10, okay, Uptown. That's a useful one to chat about. 5 got changed a lot. There's a lot of stories about that. 46, okay, pretty all over the place here. Okay, so I will get started. Feel free to keep chatting that out as we go. I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me 1 second. 17, okay. As said, I'm not sure I'll get to all of these, but useful to know. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. So, as Leah mentioned, my name is Dan Kaminsky. I'm from an organization called Citizens Union. Broadly speaking, we're a good government group. I think we're one of the oldest in the country, actually, and we do ethics, accountability, voting rights, all sort of that set of issues. But we've also been doing redistricting work for decades. And we both serve as a watchdog to make sure that the process is fair and independent, but we're also doing this civic engagement piece, coming to communities and hoping to get folks involved. So full transparency that my real goal in coming here today is exactly that. If at least a few of you are willing to engage in this process by the end of this talk, and ideally testify in front of the commission, that to me is a huge win. So we'll talk about what that means and break that down. But so kind of our goal here is at the end of the day is action. So in terms of what we're talking about today, 3 major things, right? So I'd say 3 major buckets. The first is what is redistricting? The second is why it matters. The third is how to get involved. So those are kind of the 3 buckets. When I say redistricting, I'm sure folks have been seeing redistricting in the headlines over the last 6 months. That has all been about the state process, or mostly been about the state process and what has gone on there. That was a disaster in many ways. And so I want to be clear that today we're really only or mainly talking about city council. So right now, city council is being redistricted. So we're zooming into New York City and what's happening here. Happy to field questions later on if you want to talk about the state, but just to avoid confusion. And if you haven't been paying attention about the council redistricting process, that's totally fair. Now is the perfect time to start paying attention because it's actually like the most important 3-4 weeks yet of the process. We'll talk about that as well. So a little deeper than that, those 3 buckets. We'll also talk about the criteria that map makers will use to draw the maps and how the process is going to unfold and what creates an effective testimony, kind of how to structure a testimony to give yourself the best chance of whatever you're advocating for will get heard. So that's kind of the basic agenda. Is there anything that is not on this agenda that people want to chat about? Yeah, take the pauses. That means we're good. So feel free. There's a lot of information here. And so I will do a bunch of talking and I'll pause every once in a while to just make sure that if there's a question, I'm not losing folks. And also feel free, to just virtually raise the hand and happily stop and make sure to answer a question. So, and we'll also leave room at the end to have a more, a discussion and chat about any questions as well. So first and foremost, starting at the most basic level, what is redistricting? So redistricting is the process of drawing new political boundaries throughout New York City or wherever you're drawing. It happens every 10 years, and it happens after the census to account for population and demographic changes that occurred over those last 10 years. So if you recall, the census happened in 2020. So now, based on those numbers that we now have, they are redrawing the political boundaries, and the current map as it is right now is this image on the right. So the first place I want to start is how they'll be drawing the new maps, right? So like, what criteria will these map makers use to draw the new maps? And there's 8 criteria that the map makers are going to use. 4 of this criteria is required, and 4 of them, I think the language is as much as possible. So it's not required, but they should follow it as much as they can. And I'll go through each of those criteria one by one and embed in that kind of why it matters, how it affects you in different districts and different communities. So this first criteria is one person, one vote. So what this means, the basic idea here is that each district should have roughly the same population to afford roughly the same representation. So what that means is, if just in theory, a district had 1 person and another district had 1 million people, obviously the level of representation afforded to that 1 person as compared to that 1 million people is radically different. And so with that idea in mind, each district should have about the same number of people in it. So how to get that number of people is the ideal population, as it's called, is your total population divided by how many districts are in that city, right? So in New York City terms, as of 2020, we had 8.8 million people. That's the largest our city's ever been by a significant amount. We grew by something like 630,000 people. So that's a lot of growth, which again, kind of explains why we have to do this process every 10 years to readjust the districts based on whatever has happened in the population. And we have 51 council districts. So what that means is when you divide 8.8 million by 51, the ideal population is 172,000 people, right? So over the next 10 years, each district should be redrawn to have about 172,000 people in it. But it's not expected that every district has the exact same amount of people. There's a 5% deviation allowed. What that means is that you take your ideal population and you can have 2.5 percentage points above it or 2.5 percentage points below it. So you have a 5% difference between the smallest district and the largest district, or a difference of about 8,000 people. So the numbers that the commission who draws the maps are using is 165,000 will be the smallest district and 174,000 will be the largest district. So that's kind of the bounds. And whatever they draw, again, keep in mind, these are going to be the boundaries for the next 10 years. So I'm going to jump out of the presentation just for a second. I will firstly just drop the link I'm going to show in the chat, and I'll do that throughout. I'll also email out all the links at the end. So this is the population of, let me enlarge it, council district by council district based on the 2020 census, right? So I know that I'm not going to go through all the districts mentioned, but I will at some point touch on a few. But let's just look at CD1. I know someone was from there. They have 185,000 people. Now, if you remember, the upper bounds that the commission is using, at least that they used for this first series of maps, was 174,000 people, right? So that means that CD1 had to shed 11,000 people at minimum to get into that boundary. Let's look at CD3, which is, I know several of you were from, which is even more extreme, right? If you think of CD3 over the last decade, the Hudson Yards has occurred over the last decade, along with plenty of other development. And so they've seen a population explosion, right? They had 168,000 people back in 2010, and they grew by almost 50,000 people over the last decade, right? So that means that they had to shed 20 some odd thousand people to get within that ideal population range, even more, 25,000 people. How that happens is inherently political, right? So without moving, 25,000 of you in CD3 will have changed who your representative is just from the lines drawing, right? That changes who you're represented by, how you're represented, and obviously the sort of issues that get attention. So again, the question in a lot of these districts throughout is not if the lines will change, but how. And that how ideally should come from you, right? Ideally, people in CD3, as an example, knowing that their boundaries are going to shift pretty dramatically, will be the ones to say, hey, we believe that this is how the district should look. And the commission will hopefully listen to them. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I want to pause just for 1 second about, and then actually, let me just go back to this. So I think the thing worth saying, so here's a map of New York City. Orange districts are underpopulated, green districts are overpopulated, and depending on how well shaded in is how severe over or underpopulated. But what you see is obviously we've had a ton of changes throughout the last decade. Some places lost population, other places grew a lot. And the other thing to say is they used to allow a 10% deviation between districts, meaning the difference between the smallest and largest districts could have a 10% difference. This year, Governor Hochul signed it down to 5%, meaning a smaller deviation. So we grew, coupled with the fact that there's less deviation between districts. That means a very significant portion of districts will be changing because they'll be required to. So let me pause here and just check, are there any questions, any, this is probably the most confusing one. So I want to make sure there's space to get questions, comments, concerns.
Hi. Seth, when you say it's an inherently political process, well, of course, anything having to do with politics, forgive the tautology, is an inherently political process. But what really is the politics?
Thanks for.
If you hang on a second, if you look at it from a raw metric perspective, we're really aggregating bodies as if they were cattle, and we are shepherding them from one block of a political subdivision, namely a councilmanic district, into another. So I think I'd love to hear from you more granularly when we get out of the metadata as to what is really the dynamic of that political process that decides which group gets shifted into which new or old district. Thank you, Dan.
No, thank you. Awesome question. Thanks for making me be very precise on my words. So I appreciate that. I think to some degree, as I go through, that question will be answered just by kind of what I say. And if it's not in 20 minutes or so, you feel free to ask again. So I won't answer too detailed at this moment, but I think the thing that I would say is that when I said it's an inherently political process, I think I probably should have said it's an inherently political outcome rather than process. Although obviously there are politics within the process, ideally as minimum as possible. But if you get shifted to a different district, depending on how you're moved, will change how you're represented. And how you're represented, that's politics, right? And so whether the issues you care about is represented by a like-minded person or not, or someone who has similar outlook as you or not, and so forth, all of that is politics. And we'll get a bit more into that answer as well. So great question, certainly will be touched on. And if it's not, feel free to ask again. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. Again, feel free to ask whenever something comes up. So the next criteria number 2 that map makers will be required to take into account is the language of the bill, protecting minority votes. And so in 1965, arguably one of the most important things to come out of the the Civil Rights Movement was the Federal Voting Rights Act. Among other things, what this act did is it forbid new maps to dilute the voting power of certain language minority groups and racial minority groups. The city charter has a very similar provision in it. You see at the bottom, fair and effective representation is the language that they use. So what this means tangibly is, let's say that, so we have this series of blocks. If you look at the block on the left, if let's say those red blocks in the middle are a protected group, and the protected groups are African Americans, Asian Americans, the Latinx population, and Native Americans. So if let's say that those red blocks are one of those groups, a new map could not do what you see on the right, because what you see on the right dilutes their voting power, it breaks them up and robs them the ability to elect a representative of their choosing. So hopefully that makes sense. Now let's look at some examples here in the new map. So the new maps were just released. This is a proposed map. So this is the first draft that the commission came up with. There's by no means final draft. And again, this is the key time to get involved to say if you like these maps or you don't. Again, actually, let me drop the link in the chat so folks, if you want to, can look at it. So, okay, so here's a little bit of what I mean. So, so I'm going to go to South Brooklyn, which is really, becoming a huge news story out of this first map. I'm going to go to legend and I'm going to turn on voting age, race, and Hispanic origin. So it'll color in based on the different racial groups and their dominance in different parts of South Brooklyn. And if you see the key on the right, the green is Hispanic, the blue is white, the orange is black, then the Asian is purple. Asian Americans are purple. So what this commission did, as you see, so actually let me do it like this. So these blue lines are the old council district maps, the current maps as they are. Now, if you look at the Asian American community, again, this purple color, you'll see they're split between 4 different council districts, right? So that robs them the ability, that is against the Voting Rights Act theoretically, right? Because it robs them the ability, dilutes their vote, and robs them the ability for the opportunity to elect, is the language used, the opportunity to elect a representative of their choosing. So the current map, what it does, now I'll bold it, is it draws the lines so that essentially most of the Asian American community in South Brooklyn, or much of it, is all in one district, giving them the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choosing, right? Unlike the previous map, which again, split them into multiple council districts. So while this, this has become very controversial though, because to do this, they had to connect, again, what was 2 separate council districts, 38 and 43, they had to combine into one district. And now if you look at the Latinx population here, they removed Red Hook. So again, Red Hook was part of Council District 38. And you see the Latinx population here is connected. And the new map, to make that possible, removes that portion into 38. So this might be getting a little bit into the weeds, but you can see kind of how the Voting Rights Act gets into play and how the commissioners are thinking about it to try and unite different districts to ensure that different groups have maximum voting power to elect a representative of their choosing. So that is the second criteria. Now, what's important to say about this second criteria is that so historically, what the Voting Rights Act did was set up this idea of pre-clearance, which meant that any jurisdiction with a history of discrimination in its history had to, by law, send in its new maps to the Department of Justice for pre-clearance, so essentially pre-approval. And only after the Department of Justice approved those new maps could they take effect. So jurisdictions with discriminatory histories couldn't just act unilaterally and create maps. They had to, again, get approval from the DOJ. And that kind of protected different groups. It acted as a shield against discrimination. In 2013, the Supreme Court, I'm not sure if I should mention them considering the past few months, but among many disastrous decisions that have come out of the Supreme Court this last decade, one of them, and I see your hand, Francie, I'll get to you in a second. One of them was that they struck down this pre-clearance requirement so that no longer did places with histories of discrimination have to send in their maps to the DOJ for pre-approval. So if you've been following voter suppression cases, you've seen that there's been a skyrocketing of voter suppression laws around the country. This is absolutely in response to the striking down of pre-clearance back in 2013. But what that means for us, so this will likely surprise nobody on the call, that New York City does have a history of discrimination in its map making. Specifically New York County, Kings County, and Bronx County. So every decade, we'd have to send in our maps to the Department of Justice for pre-approval. And so, and in that document, and I put the front page on the right, it's like a 500-page document, and it had to prove not only that the outcome was non-discriminatory, but that the process was non-discriminatory as well, that how they came to those lines was an open process that heard from all different groups and and the like. So this will be the first time in our history that we don't have to do this pre-approval process, which is, as an advocacy organization, something we're concerned about. And we're definitely calling on them to essentially release this document anyway, essentially still put out to the public the justification for why they chose the lines and prove to New Yorkers that it was a non-discriminatory process and the outcome was also non-discriminatory. Francie, I see your hand, so shoot.
Thanks, Dan. Quick question. In the chat, someone has observed separate but equal distribution of constituents according to party. Could you please clarify that? My understanding is at the threshold distribution of divining where the lines are and which individuals will fall within the borders of each line, meaning districts, that is a value neutral decision devoid of political party. Would you clarify that, please? Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, no problem. So again, the criteria I just went over was not about party. We'll get to party a little bit later, and honestly, probably not too much time on it because it's less relevant to New York City. What I was just talking about was entirely about demographics. In terms of party, that's, as it's known, gerrymandering, which is drawing district lines to give one party a benefit over another. There is in New York City a ban on gerrymandering, and I'm going to pause it there, and we'll get to that criteria when we get there. But awesome question, Francie. Thanks for checking that. Okay, so that was the second criteria. The next few I'm going to go through real quick. Contiguous districts, that just means each district has to be contiguous. You can't have part of a district here and another part there and another part there. It all has to be contained and compact. And the second is the final required criteria is crossover districts. That means that a district should ideally be contained within a county, but if it has to cross over, that can only happen one time per set of two counties. So for example, I see the Bronx here, CD8. CD8 has a part in the Bronx and a part in Manhattan. No other district can cross over from the Bronx to Manhattan. That can only happen once. So those were the first four required criteria. Now, these next four are, again, as much as possible that should be followed. This we'll do a lot quicker, but there's one that I do want to spend time on, and that's that first one, keeping neighborhoods and communities of interest intact. Something I should say is commissioners are supposed to follow this in order of priority. So that first one is the most important, and then down the line. So I'm just going to read this community of interest note verbatim here. So the definition of a community of interest is a neighborhood, community, or group of people who have common policy concerns and would benefit from being maintained in a single district. Another way of understanding a community of interest is that it is simply a way for a community to tell its own story about what neighbors share in common and what makes it unique when compared to surrounding communities. It is defined by local community members. So what I think stands out to me about this definition is, unlike those other ones, which have very strict criteria, I mean, down to the number, it's pretty clear this is in and this is not in, and that's the story. This is the opposite, right? This is the commission saying, you tell us, right? What is your community? You tell us what your community is and what should be contained, and we'll listen. And again, this is the highest priority among the non-required or the as much as possible criteria. So I'll give some examples, but really like open season for this, really it's up to you to define your community. Housing types can be a community of interest. Let's say, you live around a bunch of renters, but a few blocks over are a bunch of homeowners, and you want to ensure that all the renters in your area remain in one council district, because that gives you more voting power to theoretically elect a renter or someone who has affordable housing or renters issues on their mind. And so you want to ensure that the lines are drawn around your community of renters. That's absolutely could be your community of interest. Let's say you're a bus taker and you want everyone who in your neighborhood on a certain bus line to be drawn into a single district so you can advocate more effectively for transit issues and bus issues. Let's say, you are a doctor or a nurse or a teacher or whatever it is and live around a bunch of people in that same profession and want everybody in that profession to be in a same council district, again, so you can elect someone who has your issues at the heart. A similar class, right? Let's say you are working class and you live around a bunch of other working class folks, and you want everyone who's in a similar socioeconomic status to be contained in a district so that you can have economic issues at the forefront of how you elect people. The sky's the limit here. Those are some common examples that you hear, in testimony, but really it's up to you. Where do you shop? Maybe it's the commercial strip and everyone around it. Maybe it's a school district, right? A lot of times school districts are cut up into many different council districts, and that can be disadvantageous. That a lot of times people want the entirety of their school district to be within one council district, so their council member can really advocate for whatever the school district's needs are. It goes on and on. Whatever, again, you could throw all those out. It is up to you. Whatever you think your community is, geographically speaking, that is your community, and that's what should be presented. So I have a graphic on this that hopefully will kind of pin this home. I'm not a graphic designer, so I apologize for the very poor graphic here, but hopefully it'll get a point across. So let's say this square is New York City, and let's say those lines are the district lines. And let's say that gray circle is your community of interest, whatever that community of interest is. Let's say it's your school district or your bus line or whatever. Let's say these other circles are other communities of interest. So in this map, if this was the configuration of the map, you'd be at a pretty big disadvantage here because your community of interest is split up into many different council districts, right? And so whoever's representing that red square, it may take your concerns into account, but they're going to be far less loud for that council member than these other communities of interest. So that theoretically could mean that you receive less funding for whatever your issue is, you receive less advocacy, you receive less media attention, you receive less legislation, all of which could theoretically make whatever your issue is or whatever you're concerned about worse because the lack of those things, right? You're kind of off in the corner in the district, you don't represent a significant voting block. And again, it is possible that your council member may pay much less attention to you if this is your map configuration. Where redistricting comes into play is it gives us the chance to redraw the maps and do something like this, right? So in this council map, now whoever's representing that red square is going to have to take into account the concerns of your community of interest, that gray circle, as a pretty essential part of their time in office because you're kind of the heart of the district, right? You represent a majority of its voters, and there's really no ignoring you in this configuration. So again, this is kind of an example of why this matters. Now apply it to whatever issue is most important for you in your life and in your neighborhood. And hopefully it'll kind of resonate on why this process matters. So the second criteria I'll mention right here quickly is keeping neighborhoods intact. So this is a phenomenon we see all throughout New York City. So here I'm going to use the population fact finder tool, which I just shared in the chat if you want to look, but I'll go through it on my screen. So this is an amazing tool So what I'm going to do is I'll split it up into neighborhood tabulation area. I'll add map layers, New York City Council districts. So now we have the neighborhoods with the blue lines as the council district. So again, I know people are in CD1 and CD3, so I'll look at those. If we look at CD1, what we see if I click on Lower East Side is that the Lower East Side is split between two different council districts. We see CD3, not quite as bad. Midtown is sort of split, and we see Greenwich Village kind of split between a few different neighborhoods as well. So I know some people were from 28, 29, 32, 31 conglomeration. Probably the big story there is Richmond Hill. So Richmond Hill, if you see it currently, is split between three different council districts, right? And usually, and I don't want to speak for people in the neighborhood, but often people in neighborhoods that are split that dramatically between council districts really don't like it, because that means that depending on what side of the block you live on, means you could be being represented by a different person. And often, it is ideal for a neighborhood to be fully in the purview of a council member so they can fully advocate for the concerns of what's happening in the neighborhood. So, and actually I will say in the current map, Richmond Hill people are not, from what I have heard, not thrilled about it because it doesn't fully alleviate the problem. Let's see if I can zoom in on it. South Jamaica, so this is Richmond Hill, and we see a similar issue. Much of it got unified, but there's still kind of, now it's between four to some degree, 28, 29, 32, and which one is that, 27, right? So this is definitely a key issue that I'm assuming people in that part of Queens will really be mobilizing around. And if you live in that part of Queens, I'd encourage you, if you agree and think it should be more unified and more compact, encourage you to testify about as well. So, okay. So I'm going to skip these last few because I guess because I got a question on gerrymandering, I will mention that briefly. So there's one of the last, or the last criteria that I'll mention here is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is, as I mentioned, drawing boundaries to help or hurt a political party. In the nationwide context, this is crucial. In the statewide context, this is crucial. In the city context, it's really not that important. And I say that because the vast majority of New York City, you're not going to be able to draw political boundaries to hurt or advantage the Republican and Democratic Party, just because it's such an overwhelmingly Democratic city in almost every district. And so it's much less about partisan gerrymandering when we're talking about New York City council districts. There's a few where it matters, let's say like 3 to 5 council districts where this conversation is a little more relevant, but overwhelmingly it's less central than it is when we're talking about those other redistricting cycles. And here it's a little bit more about drawing lines to favor an incumbent or a certain person over, is a little bit more relevant than talking about drawing lines to favor a political party. Okay, and then there's precedent about that, but with Vito Lopez, I'm going to skip it just because of time concern here. Now, hopefully, I've kind of been embedding why this all matters, and hopefully folks have a sense of it. But just to go over this a little bit, who you're represented by on city council, I think really has broad power to shape how the neighborhood feels. I often like to say, look out your window, and virtually everything you're seeing, your council member has some amount of authority over, whether that's the trash or the parks or the police or the schools or, kind of you name it. And really everything you're looking at, the buildings, the how buildings look and how tall they can be, et cetera. Your council member really does have an impressive amount of power over that. I think many people are very focused on federal politics, as they should be. But when we're talking about neighborhood issues, what it is like to live in your neighborhood, I would say your council member has virtually the most impact on quality of life and all these other types of issues. So specifically, just a couple of examples, council members have power over land use, right? So this gets a little complicated, but just at the most basic level, during rezoning applications, so let's say someone comes in and wants to build a 30-story tower, that has to go through a whole process. And at the end of the process, the council votes. And there's this tradition of member deference, meaning that the rest of the council votes how the local member votes. So giving them a good amount of sway on what ends up happening in your neighborhood in terms of its land use. Discretionary funds. So council members get millions of dollars to spend in your district. And obviously how they spend that, can really help whatever thing you're concerned about. They're the legislative body of this city, right? So they're the ones that write the laws, and obviously getting legislation to advocate for, again, whatever you're concerned about. Having a member who has your outlook is incredibly important. Budgetary oversight. So I would say the most important document we come up with as a city every year is our budget. It's an inherently moral document, right? What are we choosing to fund and how and by how much? And the council plays a vital role in that process. And then they provide constituent services at the most local level, right? So how you're represented by on the council really matters to what life in the city feels like, and how the lines are drawn in turn affects who you can ultimately elect. So hopefully all of that kind of puzzles together and it is making sense. So the process here. So who is drawing these maps? I've been talking about the districting commission a lot. So the districting commission is made of 15 people. They've already been appointed. They've already started their work. They're actually well into the process now. So 7 of those people were appointed by the mayor. That happened several months ago in March. 8 of those people were appointed by city council. Of those 8, 3 were appointed by the minority conference, meaning the Republicans. 5 were appointed by the majority conference, meaning the Democrats. And all 15 are in. They've hired their executive director. They've elected their chair. Their chair is a guy named Dennis Walcott. Maybe sound familiar. He was the old head of he was the old education chancellor. He's now the head of the public libraries in Queens. So here's how this process is going to roll out. So they released the draft maps, which I've only begun showing you a little bit on this slide. They released that on Friday, but I will email it to you, and you should, I hope, will really take time to look at the new lines and consider how they look and feel for you and your district and your neighborhood. And all of us as New Yorkers have 30 days between the time that they were released to the times the hearings begin. So the next round of hearings are those dates, August 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 22nd. Those hearings will be in every borough. They'll be from 4 to 7 p.m. They will have language interpreters there. What else do I need to say about them? I think that's and it's hybrid, so you can go in person or you can call in remotely. And everybody gets 3 minutes, and this is really the time to tell the commission what you think about their proposed first maps. After that round of hearing, the commission will potentially retool it, but then submit it to city council. City council has 3 weeks to accept or reject the maps. If they do nothing, then the maps are automatically accepted, and this whole process is done, let's say early October, and that'll be it. And if that happens, that means that those August hearings are the last opportunity to get your voices heard. If the council rejects it, then the commission goes back, draws a second draft of those maps in the late fall. There would be a second round of hearings. Again, we don't know the dates, most likely November, or maybe December, actually. And then they would submit them again to city council. That second time they submit the maps, the city council cannot reject them. As long as the commission, 9 out of 15 commissioners, vote to accept the maps, those will be the new maps, and there's nothing that the city council can do about it. So I think that from a structural standpoint, there's a far more independent process. We saw at the state level, and I'm happy to talk about that more, but the legislators ultimately took control of the process. We think that this is far more independent because at the end of the day, city council doesn't really have authority over this process. It is this group of 15 individuals that have the final say, and city council can't get politicky about it and try and change lines and things like that. And then the final part of this process is that 6 months after that, there'll be a city council primary. So usually it's a 4-year city council term. This election, it was only a 2-year term because of this. So once the new maps are drawn, city council members will have to run again in those new districts And therefore, in a year from now or 11 months, those will be in play for election. Okay, so we've talked about hopefully the criteria, the process, how it's going to unfold. Now let's talk about actually engaging, and I'm running a little bit over, so I'll do this hopefully quick, but we're also talking, I want to kind of plug here, and maybe we'll plug again. If it's of interest, here I'll talk a bit about how to create an effective testimony, but if folks are interested in engaging in this process, we may do a follow-up workshop where we really work together to craft testimonies and submit it at the end. So if that's of interest, let Leah know, and we can organize that. In the meantime, so I'm going to skip this mapping section for time's sake. Let's go over just elements of an effective testimony briefly here. So I don't know if folks here have testified in front of City Council. I think it can be intimidating and maybe you don't know where to start. So we tried to kind of just break it down into the most essential elements. You only get 3 minutes. What are the main things that you need to include in that testimony to make it as user-friendly as possible? So we think that if you include these 4 questions, or rather these 4 answers, you have an effective testimony. Again, trying to just make it as simple as possible. So those questions are: who are you? What's the issue? Why is it an issue? And how should it be resolved? So going through each of those, who? So here you want to say your name, you want to say where you live, and that may feel uncomfortable for folks, but keep in mind that this is a geographic exercise. And so placing yourself in geographic bounds is really quite important to say, hey, I'm a community member. I've lived in this neighborhood for 10 years or 5 years or 40 years or whatever it is. It really credentializes you as someone rooted in that community. What your personal background is, and here you'll want to keep it brief. Again, you only get 3 minutes. And then organizational affiliation if relevant. So again, this is just to kind of add weight to your testimony. And here at the very least, you can all say your WCC members and anything else that might be relevant. So why are you here, right? So what's the main point? What's the main concern that you're coming to this commission for? So an example, I live in City Council District, whatever, and the current maps. So we saw that, Richmond Hill is still split up. So the current maps split my neighborhood into multiple council districts. I'm here to ensure that you amend this and make Richmond Hill united into one district. Alternatively, let's say the old map kept you together and this new one splits you up, right? So Hell's Kitchen used to all be in one district, and now it's split into 3 and with this new draft map. So you might say, oh, the old map was great, and now this new map, divided my community. Or maybe the new map removed something important from your district, maybe the hospital or something, and you want the hospital to remain. Whatever it is, just the heart of what the concern is and why you're there. Why does that matter? Okay, so we hear you that Richmond Hill is split into 3 different districts, but so what? Why does that matter? How does that affect you or your community? Is there evidence to show that it affects you or your community? So firstly, I know that, or I believe that WCC has done stuff on storytelling, and storytelling is a mode of activism, and storytelling is a mode of engagement. And certainly if you have stories here, we have anecdotal evidence to the right. If you have anecdotes and stories and ways that you can engage about how being split between all these different districts has affected you, or whatever your concern is, has affected you or your community, that's great. On the other side of the coin, if you can also include facts and data, that also can be really helpful. So whether it's demographic data or census data or data from budgets or maps, right? All of that really adds weight to the testimony. So, my community of interest is split. You provide a map, it's hard to ignore that, right? You're showing, you can't really argue, look, we're split up. This has meant whatever the why is, right? Maybe it's meant that you've gotten less funding than other communities of interest that weren't split up. If you can provide numbers to prove your point, that's great. Or whatever other results or issues. And then this lack of funding has meant all sorts of issues for our community. And then ending with the ask, right? So ending with specifically what you want the commission to do, right? So you want to speak in specifics here. And again, if possible, geography, right? So saying, please put Richmond Hill, and I'm just using that example, but whatever your example is, into one district, that's great. That gives kind of a starting idea. And I heard many people in the first round of hearings say that. If instead you can say, please move the southern boundary of the border to Atlantic Avenue, now they very clearly understand what you mean when you're saying keep us together, right? That they have in geographic terms what you're asking for, so they know how you're thinking about your community. Okay, so now I want to jump out of the presentation again, and I'm almost done. Again, apologies for going over. So this document that I'm showing, and let me again throw it in the chat. So the document I'm about to show, or am showing, is the justification. So if you remember, I was talking about how every decade they had to send in a justification document. So this was their staff document to explain why they chose the district lines that they did 10 years ago. And so I'm showing this for a few reasons, but there's actually one specific reason that I do want to show. Now, I'm going to show District 13, but it's actually really interesting to read through whatever district you're from, why they chose the lines. But District 13 is up in the Bronx. I've been working with that district a little bit. So district, again, this is from 2012, why they chose their justification, why they chose the lines they did back then. District 13 is comprised of these neighborhoods. The boundaries remain largely the same. Minor changes were made to decrease the population deviation and allow the Parkside development to be unified in District 15. Here's really what I'm getting to though. In response to public testimony, the revised plan keeps the Van Nest neighborhood in District 13 and 15 instead of dividing the area into 3 council districts as proposed in a previous preliminary plan. Additionally, the revised plan creates a new boundary in the area where districts 12, 13, 15 meet. So let's go up here into the Bronx just so I can show you. Okay, so if this neighborhood Van Nest, right? We see the blue line here. This was split between Council District 13 and Council District 15. 10 years ago, they proposed a map that split it into 3 different council districts. People came out in force, said, hey, we do not like this. Please keep us united. And they listened, and they kept, instead of having them split into 3, they got split into 2. This time around, they kept on advocating. And if you look at what this first draft of their map proposes, it takes it from 2 and it unites them fully, if you see Van Nest, into Council District 13, which is what they asked for. If you were to read through this entire document, in almost every district, it'll say something like that. In response to public testimony, we did this. Now, for those engaged in any sort of organizing, there's so many times where it's like banging your head against the wall and it feels so hard to move policy or really anything in the direction that you want it to. But I'm showing you this because this actually happens to be a process that is responsive to civic engagement. So oftentimes when people come out, and especially when groups are well organized and come out and really overwhelmingly make a demand known, there are many occasions, and there are some where it didn't happen, but there are many occasions where it did. There are many occasions where they listened to what people had to say about their communities and how they should be united. So hopefully that's somewhat of a plug to encourage folks to actually get involved in this process in time for August, right? So you have a month until the hearings begin again. Okay, so let's see. In terms of emailing and testimony, so I encourage folks to actually go in person and testify because they're, the 15 commissioners are sitting there. They can't ignore you. They have to listen to you. But you can also email your testimony in at any time. And so this email address here, publictestimony@redistricting.nyc.gov, is where to email your testimony. Even if you have just one paragraph to say, it's worth emailing in what your thoughts about your district are, just to get your voice in there somehow. Some quick best practices if you do end up testifying, which again, that's the whole goal of why we're here, is to kind of plug you in and hopefully get you to testify. So if you have ever testified, be concise and to the point. I mentioned you have 3 minutes. They're somewhat strict about it. And ideally you practice ahead of time so that and time yourself so you're there within that 3-minute boundary. like all public speaking, try and remain relaxed, try and be courteous, thank the commission, etc. There's strength in numbers. So again, which I kind of mentioned, but if you go in and say the southern border of the district should be Atlantic Avenue, that's great. If 10 people go or 20 people go, it's much harder for the commission to overlook that, right? It's, much louder in their ear. And then kind of the inverse of that is something is better than nothing, right? So if you can look up data, if you can organize people, if you can do all this, that's great. If you don't have the time, just say something, right? So saying something is better than saying nothing at all. And so if all you have capacity for is a quick email, that's better than not doing anything. So I encourage you to do that. I hope you will show up to the August hearings to advocate for whatever lines you think most accurately represent you. But if you don't have time or capacity for that, at least say something. I really hope you will consider that. Okay, so in terms of some next steps. So one, this website, citizensunion.org/NYC redistricting, is our website, which is kind of, we're treating as a one-stop shop for all things about this process. So it has all the information I just went over. So you can go there. The other thing is, as I mentioned, I will be emailing out to Leah, who can email out to everybody else, all the links, plus many links I didn't go through. There's probably 15 links with some really helpful resources for folks to kind of dig into this as much or as little as you want. I am entirely here. This is my email address, dkaminsky@citizensunion.org. I'm entirely here to help however I can in this process, however you want to engage in it. I'm entirely here. And then feel free either to chat with me, or if you want to schedule a follow-up training with this group where this is kind of the baseline information, and then kind of the 2.0 version of this, where we sit down and kind of begin crafting some testimony for you to send in on the spot, and also hopefully show up later next month to testify. We can also schedule that as well. So with that, I will stop sharing. Thank you, Denise. And let me type in my email address as well. And I'm happy to take any questions, or feel free. Also, doesn't need to be a question if you have comments about your districts, and or if you've looked at the new maps, if you have comments about that, open forum. Or I guess I'll pass it to Denisha, and then
yeah, Dan, thank you so much for this really helpful information. It's just like, oh my goodness, you've really hit home on why this is so important. Francie has a question, but we had a question from Adama in the chat, and I wanted to make sure that we got to it. The question says, for organizations that service a certain zip code, so say there's a nonprofit that services as a certain catchment area, would they have to change their guidelines based on redistricting if it changes the catchment area, like representation in the catchment area? And does funding change? I know you said city council members are the ones who really have discretionary funding, say over that in the budget, but does any other funding change because of these zone changes?
Well, great questions. So short answer, no and yes, but longer answer. So it's not gonna, the nonprofits can do whatever they'd like to do, but it'll change who they're working with, right? So if they get zoned into a different district, then let's say they had a really great relationship with whatever council member, and now all of a sudden they're working with a council member that is, they may or may not have a relationship with, or may not have worked with. So it may change depending on the nonprofit, depending on what they service, depending on how they're looking. It may change their work, but it doesn't inherently change their work. It doesn't, they're still, in the same location geographically. It's just changing the lines around them. And then funding, if they are council funded, then yes, it would change their funding, because then they would be appealing to new people, potentially, depending on what happens with the lines, to get that funding. It just depends on their funding sources. If they're funded by private sources, then it shouldn't change their funding at all.
Got it. Two other questions, and then we'll go to Francie. How do you talked a lot about community interest and being able to say, I'm like, for example, we're vets, and there's a lot of vets in this community, or a lot of people over a certain age, or a lot of children. Where do you make that known? Where do you declare that? Is that during your testimony is where you advocate for a specific community of interest, or is there another way to do that?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you listen to testimonies, often they'll hinge on that. So someone will say, like, that was a great example. I'm an older adult. And this community has a lot of seniors in it. If you break it up, then, the older adult perspective will be broken up, and you need to ensure that these blocks that contain 60% people over 60 years old or whatever, all maintained in the district. So, and you can say, your testimony is yours. So you can say whatever it is, but yeah, your community of interest, that's often where that is. Yeah.
And then other than looking at the map, because the map has a lot of information on it, is there another place where you could see what those potential new lines, like the impact it would have, where you could see the data of, like, you showed us that explanation of what they sent into the Department of Justice 10 years ago, but if I look at the map, how do I know, like, oh, we're going to lose a hospital, or we're going to lose is there a way to find out, like, what the proposed changes actually means for that district so that people can use it in preparation for their testimony?
Yeah, that's a can of worms, but a good can of worms. So there's two resources that come into mind that I'd like to show. So the first is, you use this hospital example, that I think is probably more Google Map. That I'd have to think about more what the best kind of way to consider that. But this one website that I dropped in the chat has so much information on it. It's, again, New York City Redistricting and You. So let's just, now, the first thing I should mention, I don't know if I did, is at the top, if you scroll, it's the old lines versus the new. So you can very easily compare what they're proposing right now. Again, this is their first draft map that they've just published, which now they're really seeking feedback on, versus what we currently have. So that's the first feature. The second feature is if you click on the district, right? So right now I'm clicking on Council District 13, and you get a ton of information here to the left. You get all sorts of breakdowns, demographic breakdowns, voter breakdowns. So you can kind of get a sense of someone was asking about partisan lean. You get a little bit of an idea of who's voting for who and kind of how it looks politically, party enrollment, all this sort of really fun information. You can click on legend and then toggle on all of these, right? So the one I toggled on before to show you was demographic and racial backgrounds, but theoretically you can do, transit areas or neighborhoods. What are the neighborhood breakdowns, or all these sorts of things. So there's a ton of information from this. And then the other thing, let me see if okay, so it also gives you kind of little asterisks if it's not following, or how it's following the different criteria. I mentioned this criteria of districts being compact and contained. So here it's showing you it has a compact score of 46. So it's, generally meeting this criteria, and you can hover over the little info and you get, okay, each district should be compact and no more than twice as long as it is wide. So that's the direct language in the city charter. So you can really kind of get a pretty good sense on what's happening here. That's one. I know that was a longer answer than I think you were hoping for, but I want to extend it.
No, that's great. If this map is like a go-to place and just getting folks to go to the map and toggle on the different options, and it will open up like what changes are, that's a good way to think about what are the things you care about that will be impacted by this change. And then, use that to prep your testimony.
You got it. Yeah. So this is definitely a go-to. I want to take one more minute and show one other thing, which I will email out, but this is an app called Dave's Redistricting. And this allows you to build your own map and has so much information on it. Now, when I say build your own map, usually kind of walls go up and I want to tear some walls down, and really, hopefully this can be as user-friendly as possible. And I would recommend, if folks have the time, to create your own map. And the reason I say that is because it is one thing to say, keep my community together. That's great. It's another thing altogether to say, hey, keep my community together. Here's what I have in mind, and showing them explicitly what you're advocating for. That is a much more powerful testimony. So if you have the time to create your own map, that is wonderful. And so here, I'm just going to click stuff at random here. So I zoomed in just to downtown Manhattan. So again, we see that on the left, Council District 1 is overpopulated. We talked about that earlier. So I see the current lines, and if I just start clicking, so I click the paintbrush, I can start, and again, I'm doing this randomly. I'm not advocating for these lines necessarily, I can just start clicking council precincts into Council District 2. And if you look at the sidebar on the left, you'll see that the population of Council District 1 is going down and the population of Council District 2 up. I overdid it. It's actually now overpopulated, but now I've changed the map. So let's say I like this, and again, this wouldn't work because it's overpopulated, but if I like this, I could download it and send it directly to the commission. But in addition, if you see on the right, it tells you all the information on precinct by precinct. You could also do it block by block. And then if you click statistics, it gives you so much information on the map you just drew to make sure that you're within all the different bounds and to consider how, how this looks in different ways. So again, that was probably more information than you want. And if we do a follow-up training, I'm happy to go into this app more, because I think drawing maps, will really make you understand the process a lot more in a deeper way. And also, a bit more complicated, but.
Thanks, Dan. So last question, Francie's going to close us out. She has her hand up, and I just want to say to everyone for being here, thank you so much. We really appreciate your attendance and encourage you to testify and make your voices heard in this process. It's one of the few times where public comment and as Dan said, civic engagement really matters. And so be a part of the decision making that gets made on behalf of your community. Francie, do you want to close us out with your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, and thank everyone. Dan, I'm actually in CD20, which is now one of the most hotly contested, up for grabs in portions of Flushing, Beechhurst, Little Neck, College Point, etc. Dan, one of the most strident opponents to the proposed redrawing takes the position that, gee, now we're going to have 2 council representatives, in essence, in and around our quote unquote overlapping districts. And gee, that's not such a wonderful thing. Now, my pushback on that, Dan, if you just accepted that as being the only issue, more is always better. And I think if you took any group of people, whether we broadly characterize them as middle-aged, as elders, as youth, as drill artists, within all of those demographics, we are going to find a rich variety of opinion and nuanced perspective. So a quick philosophical question, Dan. Is it inherently community engagement to have everyone who looks the same, speaks the same, and appears the same to be in one district, using that as a criteria alone? Does that in and of itself fail to appreciate the rich diversity of opinion, perspective, and point of view within every group? An easy question for you, Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I appreciate being asked. I don't know if that's necessarily an easy question, but what I would say is that to some degree, it's up to communities themselves to consider how they feel best, the lines best represent them. Secondly, that's not the sole criteria. If you remember, there's multiple criteria that commissions have to adhere to. And then people themselves tell the commission what they believe their community of interest to be, with race being only one of those considerations under the VRA, Voting Rights Act. So that's answer number 2. Answer number 3, I think that there is an easy critique here that different races are not monoliths, and unfortunately this treats them as such, right? So the Asian American community at large, they're trying to lump an Asian American community that has radically different heritages and radically different understandings and radically different, and all of this. And I think that is absolutely a detriment and easy critique of that. On the flip side, however, I do think it is really important to ensure that different underrepresented groups have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. I genuinely believe that. I think that's the heart of the Voting Rights Act, and that's what it's trying to do. And I think if you cut different groups up, it dilutes their power in our system. And so I think that's kind of the idea behind ensuring that everyone, stays together as much as possible.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, please make your voices heard during this time. Dan's gonna make sure that he sends us all the links, and we will make sure that you all get all of the resources. At the very least, take a look at the map, see what changes for your community. And if you have some time, draw your own map. As Dan mentioned, we're happy to help you prepare your testimony. If you feel like you need to practice or want some feedback, we're also happy to be here to be a resource for that. Leah, anything to add before we close out? Thank you for giving us a few more minutes tonight.
No, just thank you all so much. And please don't hesitate to let us know if you have any questions. And thanks, Dan, and thanks, Denisha, as well.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.